Thank you so much, Daniela, and the entire team for the invitation, by which I'm really honored. I'm happy to be here. As I said in the beginning, for those who weren't there yet, ECPR always feels like a little bit of a homecoming. In my PhD time, always went to IMISCO, of course, but also to ECPR. And we really, in those times, we really saved up money to go to the ECPR joint sessions, so like in Pisa. And so a lot of my colleagues where I now work with and build projects with, but also friends, they come from that period, also from ECPR. And yeah, basically I'm often introduced as migration scholar, but I'm not. I didn't study migration studies or something like that. I studied public policy, so policy sciences. With a big part political science, and kind of got lost in the world of migration studies. It's a case study that got out of hand, and it's actually quite relevant for today, because one of the big reasons why it got out of hand is that in public administration and in public policy studies, there was quite strong presence of traditional ways of thinking about public policy and how policy problems, societal problems are governed. And when, as a young student, I started studying migration and diversity, integration, we called it back then, nothing really worked, nothing really fitted, all the theories failed. And it was really exciting, actually, to put a lot of the theories to the test in migration and diversity governance, and then see that traditional policy science literature didn't really help me to understand what was going on. And that was the beginning of a journey on which I still am at the moment. And I've gone very deep into migration studies, but if you look at my publication track record, most of my publications are in policy journals. So I look at migration and diversity and try to examine more general patterns about how wicked policy problems, contested, politicized issues, how they evolve. And for today, and I'll start sharing my screen, I'll pick up on a very specific line that I've developed more recently in doing this, on focusing on complexity and complexity governance. Complexity governance has been studied a lot in areas like climate. In climate, complexity governance in the field of climate studies, environmental studies is really big. But if I look at some of the characteristics of migration and diversity, we tick even more boxes. But somehow nobody is well, not many people are talking about complexity governance in this area. So that's where I will focus on today, mainstreaming versus alienation in migration governance, and try to understand that from a complexity perspective. Well, this is basically the starting point of a lot of my work. The leading question in my work is, well, what is wrong with migration and diversity governance? Why does it so often derail? Why is it once in every so many years, once in every 10 years in many countries, it's declared a failure? Why is it often so contested? If you look at some of our core concepts, the term crisis, that is something for me as policy scientist. It's so intriguing that the term crisis, usually a crisis happens rarely, but in migration and diversity, we seem to be in constant crisis mode. We really roll from one crisis, the multicultural crisis, the integration crisis, into the refugee crisis, in whatever type of crisis, climate refugees crisis. There are so many crises in this area that says something about how we deal with the topic. If I think about the refugee crisis, it's primarily a tragedy for the people who are involved. As a crisis, I think we need to understand better, well, what type of crisis is it then, and a crisis of what? I think that remains rather unspecified often. Also in our field, we have so many concepts that are essentially contested. In policy literature, we always find that quite complex, how to make policies, but also how to monitor, evaluate, measure policies when things are very complex and contested. But in our area, it seems like we only have contested concepts. The concept integration, it's essentially contested. The concept migrant, it's essentially contested. Brussels has a different understanding of who a migrant is than the average sociologist, than the average political scientist. There are so many different interpretations. So how can you make migration policy if we don't have a good definition of it? Climate refugees, according to many migration scholars, it's the biggest category of migrants out there at the moment. But it's not a recognized concept. So what does that say? Then if you look at policies, there are so many conflicts and discrepancies that, yeah, but as a policy scientist, I tend to get very excited over that, because then for me, it's exciting to study. For instance, here, the sanctuary cities, welcoming cities, and then the conflicts and discrepancies between those cities and national policies or policies in other cities, and how do they coordinate, what conflicts do emerge. So as a scientist, I get very excited. As a citizen, it's also troubling. So if you are a citizen in a city, in a sanctuary city, then you get one message saying, "Oh, welcome, feel at home," and you get another message saying, "No, you should integrate and assimilate," and another message says, "Well, you should go away." So this invokes all sorts of fundamental questions. And the last one is that, in spite of all the complexity, I see a surprising huge amount of simple policy answers, like building walls. I had expected that after the Second World War and the experiences of the Israelis, nobody would build walls again. But what you now see is that now walls are coming back as a form of migration management. And I think every migration scholar knows that building walls is not very effective, but still they are being built. So what does that say about the policy process? As a citizen, I have certain feelings about that. But yeah, studying policy processes, my feelings are not entirely relevant, of course. So I want to understand why do we see this type of quick fixes coming up? So that's my core question. And I've discussed that question in a couple of publications. This is some free publicity for myself. And in a recent book on mainstreaming versus alienation, where the concept alienation basically stands for trying to understand why, so how and why we sometimes fail to grasp and respond to complexity, whereas mainstreaming can be a strategy, with the emphasis on can. I'm not a mainstreaming advocate who says, well, then if you mainstream, everything is solved, because that's clearly not the case. We know that from gender mainstreaming literature. But at least for an approach that is more complexity responding to complexity, and complexity recognized rather than complexity denying. So one step back into a little bit the world of migration studies before I can make a step forward into it's ECPR after all. So I will make the step into policy literature in the end. But one step back into migration literature, this complexification that I'm talking about is not such a nice word. Complexification, nice doesn't linguistically doesn't work very well, but I never found a better word. But you see that in the field of migration and diversity, the social reality has been complexifying over 3 axes. So that's what I've learned from my more sociological colleagues in this field. One is the changing patterns of migration. So the old pattern, somebody leaving one place, going on a migration journey, arriving, settling, integrating, and becoming part. That doesn't really do justice anymore to migration. We see a broad variety of mobilities. So rather than us becoming immigrant societies or arrival cities, as Doug Sanders says it, we are becoming floating cities, floating populations with mobile populations. Another one is that rather than only talking about diversity and having big groups like the Turkish population in Germany, the Moroccan population in the Netherlands, we see that that diversity has diversified. So you cannot really talk about the Moroccans in the Netherlands or the Turkish population. There are many diversities within diversity, as Hollinger says it. Like diversities along generations, along political preference, along legal status, along cultural orientation, along racial and ethnic orientation. There's no one single ethnic Turkish population. It just doesn't exist. It's often a projection of more Western literature, and We are now reviewing that, of course, more critically. Talking about race, ethnicity all the time. This can also have a reifying aspect to it. It can be a form of racism. Steve Furtevec, he's on the picture here, says we should talk about super diversity. So when we talk about diversity, we should do that in diverse terms, rather than that we try to singularize diversity by then saying, okay, diversity is about specific ethnic groups. So that is more complexity. You can no longer then say we target a policy at the terms, because that doesn't do justice to social complexity. You need a more intelligent approach to do. That's also the reason why we need to go beyond more traditional thinking about integration policy, but I'll come to that later. And the last point is that there's no one size fits all. So all the big thinking about big national models, the French model, the German model, but also the multicultural model or the assimilationist model. Rather what we see, and here I try to bring some evidence from a recent project that we are in the process of delivering. It's you don't need to, I will not go into the details here too much, but it's a process where we try to map the diversity of diversities in European cities in at least 3 countries with comparable data. And then if you plot the diversity of diversities in European cities on a map, you get this. So then along the number of different origins and along segregation, cities are so incredibly different that it's very hard to say that a city like Bari in the lower right corner could have the same policy as Amsterdam or Rotterdam or Paris or Saint-Etienne or Pau. So we need to think about this much more sophisticated way, that Rotterdam gets the approach that fits best with the Rotterdam situation. But then we need to stop thinking about the big modeling we should stop chasing the idea that there would be a one-size-fits-all approach to complex problems. Something that climate scholars have understood much better than we, which is surprising, because in climate, I think there is a more global component than there is in migration. There is nice complexity literature by Scott Page, David Byrne, let me check the name here, Geyer and Rihani, before I say it wrong. And there is good literature about it, but the connection with migration somehow is not made. And I'm rather critical of that. So I think there is something traditional in our field, which partially has to do with more traditional perceptions of seeing migrants, and that we also have the old tradition of ethnic lensing. We study migrants as being part of an ethnic group rather than as people with very diverse backgrounds. And so that is, I think we are lagging a little bit behind there, and there has been policy impact on us. So we are also sometimes following the policy models and perhaps unconsciously reproducing policy models. So I think complexity thinking can help us reaching beyond ethnic lensing. So especially after BLM, I think we need to be more aware that we shouldn't ethnic lens. I think that should be an ethics standard in our field to not to do ethnic lensing. And the same with policies. Rather than following policy models, we should be criticizing and helping. So criticizing models and helping policymakers to reach beyond models. So then, as promised, from migration studies to policy literature. And there's this very complex cliche statement, but I keep coming back to it. And it doesn't make me very popular in the policy world, and I don't get invited a lot to give talks about the fact that complex issues require complex responses. As you will, I'm sure you'll understand, because for a policymaker, that's not always what you are looking for. But as an academic, it is really what I mean. I really try to move them beyond the idea that you can have quick fixes for complex problems, or that they have the possibility at all to solve migration, to fix migration, or to fix integration, or even to fix racism. That's not the way to think about this. Right? That you try to you think of one quick fix and then you implement it and then it's all gone. I think that's really 20th century way of thinking about policy. And I studied a couple of literatures, including gender mainstreaming literature, environmental mainstreaming, disability mainstreaming literature. And what was very nice is this book was really an eye-opener. Sometimes you walk in a different conference and you read a different book and then you think, oh yes, that's what we need. That's what I had with this book of Verwey and Thompson, where they basically criticized the International Panel of Climate Change, which I found very counterintuitive because I was a big fan, to be honest, of IPCC. I thought, oh yes, very good. And they said, no, it will never work because it's not a very complex or sophisticated, intelligent approach. It treats environment as a standalone topic. And that will always fail, they say, because you need the economy, you need thinking about welfare states, you need thinking about how you design nation states and how we think about consumer behavior. So if you set experts apart and think about climate, it will always go wrong. So I thought that was a very good point. They also say from government to governance. IPCC calls upon governments to take action. And what Verwey and Thompson say is that governments cannot really solve that problem. Big companies can. Shell can, if they change their behavior. The big ICT companies of the world, if they join the nudging of people into more green behavior. European Commission can, if it stops promoting students to embark or to go on airplanes and to have physical mobility. If they stop Erasmus Plus grants to students and saying to students, you should study abroad, and otherwise you haven't had a European study experience. So this type of mobility support. So there again, an IPCC is not really helpful. You need to change mainstream policies. It's a process rather than an output. So having big IPCC conferences with big reports, that doesn't help a lot. You need then to align up a process where you work with Shell, with the European Commission, with other actors, with schools, with education, with ministers of education. And complexity doesn't have boundaries. So you shouldn't target just a couple of people, you should target everyone. So this is not just about the people active in the environmental sector. This is also about teaching our children in environment, for instance. It's about everyone, the whole society approach. Well, I was very inspired about this because it made me think of one of the books that made me choose policy sciences. This book by Helen Ingram and Anne Schneider and Helen Ingram about policy design for democracy, where they criticize democratic theory and say, well, a lot of the policy processes are not up to the task. They are just fundamentally incapable of dealing with very complex contested matters. And that leads to degenerative policy designs where some groups are privileged over others and where policy processes lead to suboptimal outcomes. And that leads to policy fiascos and fatal remedies, as others have called it. So what I'm saying is not entirely new. To be honest, I think when I wrote this book, I made a full circle and was back with Schneider and Ingram again. And still felt even more admiration than in the past about what they had been doing. This slide a little bit quickly because I'm running a little bit behind my own schedule. This is more targeted at migration scholars, basically saying that if you then look at the current governance of migration and diversity, then I don't see a lot of this complexity governance. And my colleague Adrian Pavel here sees a lot of strong belief in government and intervention. Migration government, is building walls, is fixing migration, is telling people that you could have zero migration. And that's not just Trump who did that. Dutch government also said, let's put a cap on migration, 10,000. In the end, they didn't implement it, by the way. But the fact that you could tell your voters that that would be possible, I think that's a big mistake. Integration, the whole integration discourse was about that we can intervene in integration, make it happen. It's a problem that we could construct as society. Then the positions of simplifying categorizations are already criticized. Ethnic lensing, my colleague Nina Glick-Schüller has been very firm about that. Ethnic lensing is very common also in academia. When you study one group and when you focus on one group, you almost inevitably contribute to a problematization of that group. And that's ethnic lensing, that's problematic. And that's denying the complexity that often those groups don't really exist in social complexity. And it leads to a failure of control on the street level, on street bureaucrat level, with frontline officers. I think that's a better term. Something that I came across in my research a lot, where when you really talk with frontline officers, they are very frustrated because they get all those policy demands, but they are not, put into a position where they are capable to live up to the entirely unrealistic policy expectations that you can fix migration or integration. And that contributes to a crisis mode in governance and a crisis mode with those frontline officers. So that's why you have here the drawing of my daughter. No, not really, but this romantic fairy tale picture, because I think that's a little bit, if I try to be a little bit provocative, I think a lot of the policy processes are driven by fairy tales. And this fairy tailing that you can fix migration, build walls, do integration, and that ethnic groups do really exist, which is a racializing approach. So I think I see a lot of fairy tailing, and in my book I try to criticize that. So why is this fairy tailing there? I have 4 types of explanations, and I call them alienation. Alienation is a policy process where a discrepancy is created between social complexity and trying to understand complexity, and on the other hand, trying to deny it and pretend that it's not there and come with quick fixes. Even if you perhaps know or are told that it doesn't work, you still choose for an approach that doesn't really help you to get a form of response to complexity. So why is that? What is wrong with migration governance? So one point is problem alienation. So that is just failing to understand the problem, lack of a serious conversation with the problem situation, as Rein and Schoen called it in policy sciences. That can be sometimes due to the fact that you don't have adequate data, or that the data that you have are that the data that you have, you ignore them, or the data is ethnic lensing itself. I think about it, some countries have data, compiled data on non-Western migrants, which gives the impression that that's actually one category, non-Western migrants. And if you have that information, it drives you into a certain direction. So this discrepancy between social complexity and trying to understand it, and problem information that simplifies complexity and that creates a policy processes where you act on the simplifying information, or you just deny that information with alternative facts. That's one form of alienation, problem alienation. Another one is institutional alienation. This has to do with that we have institutions who are sometimes just not capable to respond fast enough to social complexity. I think about perhaps the most straightforward example is the institution nation state and citizenship. This was designed in a different time when there was less mobility and when there was less diversity also. So how can we help those institutions then line up with complexity? See a lot of friction here. Think about dual citizenship. I mean, it's very common now. It's becoming a new normality in a super diverse world. But how can we help our institutions to respond? And if institutions fail to do that, then we have the famous example of institutional decoupling here. So that's institutional alienation. Welfare states is another example. I think we all want to preserve welfare states, but it has never been thought through very carefully. How do you, because welfare states need a solidarity, which often needs to be bounded. So what do you do with a welfare state if you want to have an open society? Another one is political alienation. This is the one that is most recognized in migration literature, where there is estrangement of complexity for political reasons, which may be political parties and populism, which forces simplifying interpretations. Populism can be leftist and rightist populism, by the way. Both can be simplifying in terms of migration and diversity. But it can also be economic inequalities. I think about big business, who on the one hand often supports culturally conservative discourse, but on the other hand wants open borders because cheap labor helps big business, of course. This is the client politics thesis that I'm sure you're all aware of Freeman. I think political alienation explains the gap that Freeman is talking about. Political alienation means that some politically privileged groups have more to say about policies and curb it into their direction. And that creates a discrepancy with the narratives, the discourses that they tell to the voter, that they want to be rather restrictive. Last form, social alienation, is that also in our language, in our discourses, we often reproduce simplifying stories. I think the term superdiversity is helping us to reach beyond that, beyond ethnic lensing. But a lot of our language is trying to simplify the reality of diversity into clear groups, for instance, or into clear categories. Even the language of thinking about asylum migrants or labor migrants or climate refugees, that's simplifying literature, simplifying discourse. In reality, often a migrant has multiple reasons why he or she would migrate or not. I think for humanitarian migrants, you could say, well, that can be driven totally or almost entirely by purely humanitarian reasons, and we have an asylum system to check that. But for labor migrants, usually it's a combination. And for some humanitarian migrants, it can also be a combination. And for family migrants, it can also be a combination. So this legal discourse is a simplifying discourse as well. And that can promote the inclusion or exclusion of groups. I think also the fact that we don't recognize the term climate refugees, that excludes climate refugees from the debate that we have about humanitarian migration. So what should we do then? Then mainstreaming is something that I am taking from the literature on environmental mainstreaming and gender mainstreaming as a theoretical approach for grasping complexity. Theoretical, because especially in the gender mainstreaming literature, there's also a lot of examples on how if mainstreaming is not applied properly in practice, you can get a lot of negative side effects. But in theory, mainstreaming says, well, you need to have an integral approach to complex issues because they are complex. So you cannot say gender is just, for one minister with one department, with one budget, and it's just about women. That's not what would work very well. An environment is not something only for environmental departments, only about actors in that sector, talking about environmental licenses per se, for instance. Environment is about everything. It's about social affairs, foreign affairs, labor, it's about everything. Gender is about everything and about everyone. Everyone should talk about gender. In mainstreaming and diversity, we should reach that same level. We are cross-sectoral. We are precisely a topic that should never be siloed. And I think now we are a siloed sector. We are a parallel sector. We are a pillar, a silo, rather than something that is organized cross-sectorally. I think that is a mistake, and we can learn there from environmental and from gender mainstreaming. We should think about the process rather than a model or one solution. Well, I think I elaborated that point already. Think about complex actor networks. I think there we are making steps, but I'm often still surprised about how much we criticize governments, but then still put demands on governments. So then we ask governments to solve migration still. And I come back later with a counterintuitive example about the global compact of migration. Whereas a citizen, I would say, oh yes, that's very good. That's a positive direction. But as a scholar, I don't know, to be very honest. Is that a positive direction? Is that complexity responsive mode? Or is the belief that we can upscale this to the UN, come with a global compact of migration, and then fix everything? Isn't that a little bit naive? Isn't that then the same as what IPCC was doing? Don't we need more diversity in our approach, more localizing, decentralizing? Wouldn't that be better? Isn't it a sort of is it a symbolic move to the UN, which can be very counterproductive because now cities feel even more alienated because they don't just need to listen to nation states. Now they also need to listen to the UN. That it doesn't feel very enabling to cities. And another part is targeting the whole diverse population. That's also something that we learned in Rotterdam. that focusing diversity on only migrants, that led to a first big backlash in our city. And partially that was also driven to the fact that policies were never targeted at the whole population. Also to help other Rotterdammers to come on board of diversity and try to understand the rapid transitions of their city. Okay, I'm almost there. I will skip this slide because I gave all the examples already, so I can move to that very quickly. I did Global Compact of Migration now, but I do want to conclude with one, where am I now? Yeah, one slide, and then it's the end of my presentation. So what does this mean then, mainstreaming? So my call for mainstreaming and integration governance, what does that mean now if we take a step back again as migration scholars, as policy scholars? I think we need to move beyond this constant debate about pessimism and positivism in migration, in thinking about migration and diversity governance. And not this positivism that we can fix it, we can solve it, but also pessimism that goes a step too far. The constant criticizing that everything what governments do and what other actors do, it's all wrong and it doesn't help, because this polarization misses the point that there is, I wouldn't say middle ground, because that always sounds so tame, lame, I think, as Americans would say it then. But there is a middle ground which works far better, where we as scholars work with complexity, but then also there are modes of coping with complexity. Complexity doesn't mean, oh, it's all complex, so let's just leave it. We cannot do anything anymore. That's really not true. And I think in gender, just to pretend that in gender you would say, oh, gender is such a complex topic, so I don't do anything about it, it's too complex. That would just not be okay. And I think we are saying more or less that now in the field of migration. It's so complex, governments fail, so just leave it. And I think that is a big mistake. So there is a big world between pessimism and positivism, but then we should really provide an answer there. It requires an investment in the quality of the policy process. So one of the reasons why we are alienating so much is because the factors leading to alienation are dominant, and the factors leading to or providing space for mainstreaming are recessive. So they cannot live up to the factors that lead to alienation. So this says something about the quality of the policy process in migration and diversity governance. So this is something that we should understand. We should not only criticize the outcomes, but then also help understand the policy process to be able to enhance the quality of the policy process. And one of the ways to do that, and here I stand on the shoulders of people like Beck, Bourdieu, and Rein and Schoen, of course, is to invest in the reflexivity of this project. Also reflexivity in research policy dialogues, that we help enhance the quality of the process and think about not only where is the complexity, so recognizing it, but also think about the modes that can help to do something about it, but also be self-critical. I think in migration studies, we haven't been also always doing the best that we can do, to put it very diplomatically, in terms of also understanding complexity ourselves. Especially when it comes to ethnic lensing, I think we don't have a very good track record. When it comes in terms of thinking about national models, we also don't have a very good track record there. And in being dependent on policy models, we also don't have a very good track record. So yeah, I think enhancing complexity understanding starts also, so changing the world starts with ourselves also in that sense. And the one way to do it, and that's also why I'm happy, and then the circle is round for my talk, is to mainstream migration studies as well. So let's stop talking only to migration scholars. Let's connect our field with others more. Let's try to make a contribution to mainstream political science literature on what does migration and mobility mean for democratic theory, for democratic systems. For sociology, what does migration and mobility mean for thinking about inequality, for instance, and about cohesion, about welfare states, for instance. I think that is the maturity of the field of migration studies, if we have reached that stage. So then we should mainstream ourselves and go to conferences like the CPR. That's it. Thank you so much for your patience and listening to me. And I hope we have enough time left for all